Council. Thank you very much, President. Dear friends, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here today. Let me start by expressing my thanks to and welcoming the work of the French President to maintain our commitments, to make sure that the world can anticipate, resist, and be resilient to these challenges. So what do we need for this? Firstly, I would say this past century was marked by two tragic world wars, following which there was a glimmer of hope through the decision by some political leaders to try to build a multilateral model. Imperfect, of course, taking into account what African colleague has said, but through the UN, through the EU and other organizations, an attempt was made by countries in the world to try to turn their back on the temptation to isolation and nationalism, and on the contrary realize that peace and prosperity and security should mobilize everyone. And my absolute conviction is that this pandemic shines a very bright and painful light on a certain number of challenges that existed before COVID, and that our generation, not just political, but in every sense in terms of generations and civil society, are confronted with because we need to do what we're doing now, take the time to think about how we can work together. Firstly, with respect to the pandemic, as Emmanuel Macron said very clearly, we are fully mobilized and committed to have concrete cooperation with ACT, for example. It's a very realistic project. It's very specific. In just a year, we produce results. Usually it takes 10 years to deliver a vaccine. This shows that we've been very ambitious. It's a long way to go, and we'll remain fully committed. Second thing, just now I came up with the idea that I will repeat here, that perhaps we need to go further and learn from this pandemic that's striking us. We perhaps need an international pandemic treaty to have a stronger international commitment to prevent them. We feel it's necessary here. And so that if they emerge, we can respond more quickly and more coordinated manner to make sure that there's the medical equipment, whereas it's needed, and exchange information so that we can make sure that we protect our citizens better. So that's the first idea, the pandemic, and a few things we need to do in response. Second idea, I don't want to take up too much time on this because we discussed this already prior to the pandemic. We know that climate change was a major challenge for the whole planet, for everyone. And this has been highlighted even further by the pandemic, when we need to be mobilized through investments to support our ability to transform our metals for development, production and consumption. We're all in the same boat there, not just governments around the world. It has to be civil society, NGOs, citizens, organizations big and small. They need to be involved. The EU intends to play its role. This is what we have said with respect to climate neutrality by 2050. And we're involved in climate diplomacy with the UN, of course. So we will systematically try to ensure that that dimension is taken into account so that we can push back this threat ever more. A third thing I want to say is that, bearing in mind what happened last century with its tragedies, but also looking at the suffering in this century, we should never forget that we're all part of the same mankind. And that is what is enshrined in the UN Charter, the dignity of every human being, of whatever origin, birth or social status, dignity and personal freedom, and fight against discrimination. That is what should bring us together. That's the common thread that binds us all. And there's threat that we've seen recently in France and Austria and other places. Well, it's not new, but it's something we all need to mobilize to combat. We have to go to the root cause of the problems: hate speech, apology of terrorism, and the fact that some are tempted to use this to engage us all in a vicious cycle of distrust, rejection, and then, unfortunately, sometimes violence. Whereas what we need is a virtuous cycle of dialogue and mutual support, but being very clear about our respect for everyone's beliefs, but also the conviction that there is a fundamental freedom that we need to protect. That should be the main focus of our action. So there are a few ideas I wanted to share with you. What we need is a fairer world, a world that's more just and resilient, able to resist shocks and clashes when they occur, because they will. We need to anticipate more and better